What are the things that inspire you when nothing seems to be working?
It's quite easy, really. It's the records that really turn me on right in the early stages of things. They can still have a real profound effect on me listening to them.
Jimmy Page has never been one for gratuitous praise. But when it comes to Little Feat, the American outfit formed by Lowell George and Bill Payne in 1969, he doesn't hold back. My favorite American band, he once said flatly. In a 1975 Rolling Stone interview, Page raved about their playing, their grooves, and their originality. For a man whose own band had transformed the very sound of rock, that was no small compliment. What fascinated Page about Little Feat was their rhythmic precision and their fluid blend of styles. They had the swing of New Orleans funk, the grit of blues, the polish of pop, and the looseness of southern rock, yet sounded like none of those things exactly.
You have, I said, blow away this cruel reality and keep me from this storm.
Page was especially taken with George's slide guitar playing and the interplay between members, which he saw as disciplined but instinctive. "They've got this great elasticity," he said. "The way they push and pull the rhythm, nobody else sounds like that." Their 1973 album Dixie Chicken particularly struck a chord with Page, not just for its musicianship, but for its wit and soul. There's a looseness on that record that mirrored some of the things Led Zeppelin explored in tracks like Black Country Woman and Boogie with Stu. Page wasn't just hearing music, he was hearing ideas. But his admiration wasn't limited to aesthetics. He also respected how Little Feat operated. They were a band of top-class musicians who never chased commercial approval. Page, who spent most of the 70s trying to keep Led Zeppelin creatively autonomous, saw a kindred spirit in Lowell George, a man as stubborn as he was talented. Little Feat never reached Led Zeppelin's scale, but Page didn't seem to care. To him, quality and integrity were always more important than fame. That admiration for musical freedom would push Page to look elsewhere for artists who were just as committed to doing things on their own terms. If Little Feat offered Page a groove-based eclecticism, then the Incredible String Band provided something entirely different, a gateway into the mystical, the arcane, and the wildly experimental. This British folk duo turned collective, led by Robin Williamson and Mike Herron, had already made their mark by the time Led Zeppelin rose to fame. Their 1968 album, The Hangman's Beautiful Daughter, was nominated for a Grammy and helped set the standard for what was then called psychedelic folk. Page was intrigued by their fusion of ancient-sounding acoustic instruments, modal tunings, and lyrics full of allegory and nature worship. He never publicly championed them as loudly as he did Little Feat, but his quiet fondness for the band has been noted in multiple accounts, including from close associates of both Page and Plant. It was music that seemed to belong to another age, and Page, deep into Celtic lore and occult texts, was a willing participant in that imaginative world. What made the Incredible String Band stand out to Page was their sense of freedom and disregard for pop convention. Their songs often had no traditional verse-chorus structure, instead unfolding like rituals or incantations. "They weren't afraid to be strange," he once said. That approach mirrored his own ideas about arrangement, especially in tracks like Kashmir or No Quarter, where the linear storytelling and improvisation took precedence over catchy hooks. This experimental bent had a direct influence on Led Zeppelin's acoustic output. The eclectic instrumentation on Led Zeppelin III, with dulcimers, mandolins, and Eastern flourishes, owed something to the template laid down by bands like the Incredible String Band. Page was never trying to copy their sound, but he certainly felt emboldened by their fearless eccentricity. Still, for all their innovation, the Incredible String Band were often dismissed by mainstream rock fans as being too whimsical or self-indulgent. That kind of dismissal only made Page more interested in those who refused to be conventional. Where the Incredible String Band represented folk psychedelia at its most freeform, Pentangle was something else altogether: meticulous, elegant, and technically formidable. Jimmy Page was a known admirer of this British group, whose lineup included jazz double bassist Danny Thompson and legendary fingerstyle guitarist Bert Jansch. Their debut in 1968 turned heads for its seamless blend of folk, jazz, blues, and early music, genres that Page was already quietly folding into Led Zeppelin's architecture. His admiration for Bert Jansch went back years. "Bert Jansch is the man who got me into acoustic guitar playing," Page told Guitar World. In fact, Page famously lifted a version of Jansch's arrangement of Blackwater Side for Led Zeppelin's Black Mountain Side, a move that's been widely scrutinized. But the inspiration was real. What Jansch did with tone, phrasing, and fingerpicking was revelatory to Page, who had come from a world of blues licks and rock riffs. Pentangle took that acoustic discipline and elevated it into group dynamics. Their albums like Basket of Light and Cruel Sister showed how folk tradition could be reimagined with jazzy chords, irregular time signatures, and classical forms. Page once commented that Pentangle's compositions were on another level, suggesting that their use of space and dynamics taught him lessons that he later applied to songs like Going to California and The Rain Song. But Pentangle never became a mass-market success, partly because their complexity didn't lend itself to simple radio edits or big tours. That level of purity made them even more appealing to Page, who was increasingly disillusioned with the idea that music had to conform to commercial expectations. So far, Jimmy Page's favourite bands weren't the obvious chart toppers or the critically deified names you'd expect. Do you agree with his choices? Would you have picked others? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear which bands shaped your view of rock music and whether Page's picks still resonate today. By the early 1970s, Jimmy Page had become fascinated with progressive rock, particularly the strands that retained strong melodic and classical elements. That led him to Renaissance, a band formed out of the ashes of the Yardbirds, the very group Page himself had once joined. While Renaissance's lineup soon changed completely from its original Yardbirds alumni, their sound became something unique. Symphonic rock with Baroque textures, folk roots, and the ethereal vocals of Annie Haslam.
Down into the world of seeing, come and heal before. Take the time to find the feeling, see everything on its own.
Page didn't often speak at length about Renaissance in interviews, but he reportedly admired their arrangements and the ambition of their concept albums. What drew him in was their commitment to complexity, without sacrificing beauty. Albums like Ashes Are Burning and Turn of the Cards were marked by sweeping orchestration, acoustic guitar flourishes, and a sense of narrative structure that Page himself had long tried to master. He saw in them a musical counterpart, artists who pushed boundaries, drew from medieval and romantic themes, and treated rock music as something capable of majesty. Renaissance didn't play loud or raw, they played with precision, elegance, and emotion. Page respected that. It was another path to transcendence, one that didn't involve volume or attitude, but craft and atmosphere. Despite their innovation, Renaissance often struggled to find traction in the wider rock world, especially in America. That disconnect reminded Page of how often truly original acts could be misunderstood or overlooked by the mainstream. In a 1990s interview, long after Led Zeppelin had disbanded, Jimmy Page revealed a surprising fondness for Soundgarden. At first glance, this grunge-era Seattle group might have seemed an odd fit for a man who'd made his name 2 decades earlier. But Page was never limited by generational lines. "They've got a heaviness and darkness to them that I really like," he said, noting how their guitarist Kim Thayil managed to create something heavy without descending into cliché. Soundgarden had, by their own admission, been deeply influenced by Zeppelin. Tracks like 4th of July and Mailman throbbed with a sense of menace that owed something to the Page blueprint: alternate tunings, thick riffs, and atmospheric production. But they weren't copying, they were evolving it. Page noticed that, and respected it. "They've taken it somewhere new," he once said. Chris Cornell's voice, part howl, part hymn, also caught his attention.
Black days, how would I know that this could be my fate?
Page had always valued vocalists who could move between fragility and power, and Cornell had that range in spades. For Page, Soundgarden represented not just a throwback to the kind of drama and weight he'd built with Zeppelin, but a sign that younger generations were still mining those emotional depths with sincerity. But grunge was often written off by older rock purists as scruffy, nihilistic, and sonically limited. Page saw past the flannel and distortion, recognizing a band whose ambitions mirrored many of his own.